Hey, and welcome back. This is lecture number 4. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at emotional intelligence. I'm going to briefly talk about some of the science behind it. We're going to go down to the neural level and look at what some of the brain areas that deal with emotional intelligence. In the previous lecture, we just went over the 4 main lobes of the human brain, just to give a broad overview of it, because we are going to be mentioning some of the lobes throughout the course. So for people who aren't familiar with the brain area or the main brain areas of the human brain, the previous lecture was kind of just to give you a broad definition of that. So in this particular lecture, we're going to be talking about some early findings on the emotional circuitry for emotional responses. We're also going to be covering the particular brain circuitry for emotional intelligence. And then we're going to go over the 4 main areas of the brain that deal with emotions and intelligence. So we're going to be talking about the amygdala, the somatic-sensory cortex, the orbital frontal lobe, and the anterior cingulate. So back in 1937, there was a professor named James Papez who had theorized that emotional responses were involved with certain parts of the human brain. And of course, back then, they didn't have the type of technology that we have today. But he did come up with 4 brain areas that he felt were responsible for emotional responses. The first one was the hypothalamus, which is the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. He also said that the anterior thalamus, which deals with alertness and learning. He also included the cingulate gyrus, which receives input from the thalamus, and the neocortex. And the neocortex is the top part of the brain that deals with all of our cognitive functions, and also the hippocampus, which mainly deals with memory. And then a few years later, another scientist, Paul MacLean, although he didn't remove what James Papez has mentioned, he said, well, there's a few others that need to be included as well. And those were the amygdala, which we're going to be talking about later, the orbital frontal cortex, which we're going to be talking about later, and also the basal ganglia. And I have a slide about the basal ganglia, which will be very interesting. And then in 1994, Antonio Damasio, he kind of confirmed what Paul MacLean had said as far as the brain areas that are involved with emotional responses. So the brain circuitry for emotional intelligence, we have the right amygdala, there's the somatic sensory insular cortex, there's the orbital frontal lobe, and then there's the anterior cingulate. And the reason why I have the right amygdala bolded and the orbital frontal lobe bolded is because these two are the main component of the brain circuitry for emotional intelligence. This is what links emotions with action, and depending on how strong the emotion is will depend on the type of action we take. And that's the communication between the amygdala and the frontal lobe. So we each have 2 amygdalas. We have one in each side of the hemisphere. The amygdala on the right side is the one that's responsible for emotional responses. And there's been tons of studies and different type of tests done to kind of confirm that the right amygdala is the one that's responsible for emotional reactions and responses. So some of the responsibilities of the right amygdala, it deals with negative emotions, so such as fear and sadness. So if somebody's if we're walking out one day and we see something like a snake, and then of course the amygdala will interpret that as a threat, and then it will kind of literally take over the brain. It will send different signals to different parts of the brain to say, hey, there's something, there's danger in the environment. We need to get out of here. So it'll probably send more blood to your legs where you can run faster, or if you're in a situation where you need to fight, then more blood will flow to your hands, making it easier for you to pick up and grab something with a stronger grip. It's also been linked with taking action. Like I said earlier, there's a strong connection between the amygdala and the frontal lobe. It also interprets social cues. And the Bar-On study, I was going to talk about the Bar-On study, but I'll probably more so like to talk about a situation of the lawyer, and the concepts are the same. There was a corporate lawyer who had a brain tumor on his frontal lobe, or close to the frontal lobe, and he went in for surgery. After the lawyer came from the surgery, everything that was as far as cognitive wise for the lawyer, everything was tested as accurate as it was before. However, he couldn't perform daily tasks any longer. So he lost his job, he lost his wife, lost his family. He ended up living in a spare bedroom in his brother's basement. And so with an act of desperation, he went to go see Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist we had mentioned earlier. And he asked, what's going on? So Damasio did all types of different tests on him and found out that cognitively he was just as sharp as he was before the surgery. But what he found out was that there was the connection between the amygdala and the frontal lobe was cut. And so, and Damasio figured it out when he asked the lawyer, when should we meet again? And so the lawyer said, or the lawyer was giving him all the details of the next 2 weeks, but he couldn't pick a date. And that goes back to and that was because he couldn't attach a feeling to the decision he was trying to make. And Damasio says whenever we're trying to make a decision, we have to be able to attach some type of feeling to it. So the circuitry that was responsible for this for the lawyer, that circuitry was cut. So the lawyer could no longer attach feeling to making a decision. And that goes back to what I said earlier. Whenever we have a decision that we're trying to make, there has to be some type of feeling we need to attach to it, whether it's joy, whether it's sadness, whether it's elation, whether it's excitement. There has to be some type of feeling that's attached to it. And next we can go over the somatic-sensory cortex. It deals with sensory input, responsible for self-awareness and empathy, which is going to be a big component of emotional intelligence. And of course, any injuries to this part of the brain would result in adverse effects such as becoming less sympathetic and then also less self-aware. And then we have the anterior cingulate, which is close to the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the middle part of the brain, which is a nerve of band fibers that separate the left and the right hemisphere, but it also sends signals and communication between the two hemispheres. And some of the responsibilities of the anterior cingulate, it deals with impulse control, also deals with reward anticipation. So if we're performing a particular act or a particular habit, it's the anterior cingulate says that would say to us, well, because you're doing this, this is the result you'll get from doing that. So we also deals with decision making and empathy, and deals with a lot of autonomic functions such as heart rate, blood pressure, keeping our body temperature where it needs to be. And then we also have the orbital frontal lobe, which is again one of the more important components of emotional intelligence, receiving a lot of communication from the amygdala. And some of the responsibilities of the OFC, it deals with personal and interpersonal problems, deals with managing our impulses, our relationship with others, which is one of the other components of emotional intelligence when it comes to relationship management, and it also decision making as well. So in this lecture, I want to give you a brief overview of emotional, or the science behind emotional intelligence. Didn't want to go over too much because that's going to be kind of outside of this course. However, in the next section, we will go into emotional intelligence itself, and things will start to seem a little bit more practical. And then in the last section, we're going to be covering some more practical things you can do to kind of improve your emotional intelligence. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the next section.